Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the RHIA Rapid. And for today, we're going to be focusing on Domain 3. So our question reads, a healthcare facility has decided to adopt a tool that helps with multidisciplinary care planning. What tool meets these criteria? And we have our four options here: clinical pathways, clinical practice guidelines, clinical provider order entry, and electronic health record. Answering this question is going to require you to know the definitions of each of these terms, and then picking the one that best suits the first sentence of the question. So let's go through each one and discuss what each of these definitions are about. Clinical pathways is something that you can find on page 631 if you have the newer edition of the HIM textbook, and that's the 6th edition. Okay, so HIM Concepts, Principles, and Practice textbook by Oates and Waters. So if you do have that book and you have the 6th edition, if you turn to page 631, you will find a page where they discuss all the details that you would need to understand when it comes to what a clinical pathway is. And a clinical pathway or pathways are structured multidisciplinary care plans which detail essential steps in the care of patients with a specific clinical problem. So for example, if I were working at a clinical facility and I needed to outline how to take care of patients that have asthma versus patients that have diabetes, then I would be able to make a clinical pathway that showed the steps that would need to be taken in order to treat each of these different types of patients. Next, B, we have clinical practice guidelines. A clinical practice guideline is actually something that I was unable to find in the textbook. However, I'm going to go ahead and show you where on the internet you can find this information. What I did to get here is I typed in clinical practice guidelines in Google. And when I typed in that information, I saw a long list of different articles about clinical practice guidelines. So just FYI, if you are looking things up on Google to study for your exam or for any type of, research-based assignment that you may have, you want to be sure that your resources are valid and you want to go to places that are reliable. So this is a NIH website, the US Department of Health and Human Services, which I would classify as a site that I can trust. And on their website, they have a definition of what clinical practice guidelines are. And clinical practice guidelines are systematically developed statements to assist practitioners and patient decisions about appropriate health care for specific clinical circumstances. So these are statements that will assist someone about making the right decision. So what really is the true difference between a guideline and a clinical pathway? A clinical practice guideline is going to be a more generic set of standards or guidelines that need to be followed in order to create a clinical pathway, versus a clinical pathway that's going to be very, very specific depending on what type of clinical situation that the patient has. So for my last example, I was speaking about asthma and diabetes, and they each have their own clinical pathway. But regardless of which pathway that needs to be taken, they both are going to have a standard clinical practice guideline that would need to be followed before a pathway can be created. So I want you to think of a hierarchy, and I would place the clinical practice guidelines above clinical pathways. So clinical practice guidelines are needed or required in order to create clinical pathways, right? And if that still is a little shaky for you when it comes to understanding, please review this article and also look through other sites that are trustworthy, that will discuss this topic in a lot more detail. I did want to point out that the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, with the acronym AHRQ, which you should know what that is and what they do for your RHIA, they also talk about clinical guidelines and recommendations on their website. So this is another reference that I was able to find by simply typing in, the keyword into Google. So Google is your friend, guys. Please use it. But once again, be sure that you're going to a website that you can truly trust. And these agencies are dependable. For C, we have clinical provider order entry. And this term, which you should know for your RHIA as well, or you can also see it as CPOE sometimes. This is the idea that a provider is able to enter in a order, whether it's for medication or for labs or for whatever the case may be, through a clinical system, some type of technology. They can use that to easily enter in information in order for a patient. And you can find these in EHR systems and other systems as well. D is electronic health record, or EHR. And that is a digitized medical record that is used to view information about a patient. So back in the day, information used to be placed in a physical folder that was, placed into file cabinets, and they had out guides and all this stuff going on to keep, structure. And now we have and are continuing to work towards converting these files into electronic records. And this allows us to easily move them from different locations. And it also just makes things easier when it comes to interacting with other providers for that patient's care. So we've now defined all of these terms. So the question is, which tool meets the criteria of being able to help with multidisciplinary care planning? And so the correct answer here is going to be A, clinical pathway. And the thing that's very interesting about this question is that when you read the definition on page 631 of your textbook, you would see that the verbiage that was used in the textbook, it lines up very closely to what's in this question. Okay, so if you haven't read or don't know anything about the systematic and process-driven focus to improve performance, then I definitely want you to be sure that you read and review page 631, because it is important for your RHIA. So the answer here is going to be A, clinical pathways. So that is our RHIA Rapid for today. I hope that was helpful. If you find yourself confused about these questions or just not sure what to do, I want you to just continue to answer the questions that are in that AHIMA Practice Question book. It's very helpful. It's going to help you figure out the topics that are very important for you to understand. So remember to study smart, not hard. And I will see you guys on the next RHIA Rapid.